So we're in week 30. We're dealing with Ezra and Nehemiah. And for this week, I've decided to look at the following topics. We're going to overview what's happening historically, and then look at something called the Cyrus cylinder. We'll talk a little bit about Alexander the Great and his influence and how that led to the Septuagint. Talk a little bit about how they tried to stop the works of God, both anciently and even modern, in a modern perspective. I'll walk on the wild side. We'll talk about weeping and shouting for joy. The Feast of Tabernacles, or often called the Feast of Tents, and building faith, plus anything else you want to talk about. So to start with, Ezra and Nehemiah were originally just one book, but in modern times, they've been often regarded as part of the Chronicles history. The concluding verses of Chronicles 2:36 are actually very, very close, almost virtually identical with the opening verses of Ezra. So you can see at one time the books were actually joined. We're going to learn a little bit about Cyrus, who was the king of the Persian Empire. He made a decree which was recorded on this cylinder. It talks about the Persian policy towards conquered people. This cylinder is currently located in the British Museum in London. Traditionally, the Persians were much more tolerant or generous, you would say, than the previous empires. The policies of Cyrus toward subjugated nations have been contrasted to those of both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who had treated their subjects rather harshly. He permitted the resettling of those who had been previously deported and sponsored the reconstruction of religious buildings, not only for just the Jewish nation, which I think most people know about, but for all the nations that had been subjugated. He was very magnanimous, allowing captured people to return to their native land, and then actually gave them money to allow them to rebuild their religious structures.
Very different approach to ruling an empire than we've seen before.
Yeah, extremely different approach. This edict of Cyrus is the first known human rights declaration, and there is a replica of it on display at the UN headquarters. And it was dated 539 BC. It was made by the British Museum from the original in its collection. And the UN uses it to highlight the whole idea of human rights. Okay, so if we're talking about history, we've already talked about how the Assyrians were taken out by the Babylonians, who were taken out by the Persians, and eventually they're going to be taken out by the Greeks and then the Romans. And so this is a map of the conquest of Alexander the Great, which happened in the 330 range, and he took over the Persian Empire. Now, the result of this was that the Greek influence became quite universal in the Mediterranean area. And because of Aristotle, who was Alexander's tutor, imagine having Aristotle as your tutor. He had a very positive disposition towards God, towards there being some sort of a creator and the Jews. And instead of destroying and subjugating the Jews, he made an arrangement with them. As long as they were loyal and they paid their taxes, they could have their autonomous religion. That was a huge concession because Alexander was not usually that accommodating. Out of gratitude to Alexander, the Jews did a couple of things. First, they agreed to name every child born the next year Alexander. And that is why the name Alexander, or Sender for short, became a common Jewish name. But it had further repercussions because it opened the door for the Jews to give their children other Greek names. And then ironically, through showing their gratitude to Alexander and naming their children after him, they unwittingly opened the door to the Greek language and then the Greek culture. So then their culture began to change. The Jews also agreed to install a system of tax collection that would lead to corruption. Indeed, it was so inherently corrupt that the Talmud held that anyone who was a tax collector was presumed to be a thief. And you see that go all the way through to the New Testament times. And that was because of this very corrupt Greek tax system that was instituted by Alexander and then carried on. He didn't plan on dying as early as he did at age 32, but when he died, he left the whole Greek world in kind of a chaos. His entire empire could have fallen apart, but instead they divided it into 4 kingdoms, one for each of his major generals, and 2 of the kingdoms affected the Jews almost completely. The northern empire was ruled by one of his generals and became known as the Seleucid dynasty. It was headquartered in Damascus. The other one was ruled by Ptolemy, another general, and was headquartered in Alexandria in Egypt. And there were all kinds of cities. I can't remember that more than 20 cities in this area are named Alexander because of Alexander the Great. The 2 generals kind of agreed on virtually everything except for where the line divided between the north and the south Greek kingdoms. And that put the land of Israel right in the middle of their disagreement. The Jews were caught in this tremendous power struggle. So for the next 130 years, there would be this kind of balancing act that the Jews did, swaying either to the north or to the south. The south attempted to win the Jewish people by persuasion and culture, and the north attempted to do so by force, but both would ultimately fail. This is also the backdrop for the story of Hanukkah, which is the celebration that continues to this day. Eventually, the northern kingdom gets tired of the game that they're playing. They send in the army, and the Jews resist. And this sets up a dramatic event where the Maccabees enter the picture, who rebel against the Greeks and take over the kingdom for a period of time. The independence ends rather dramatically after they ask the help from the Romans, who then come in and turn that help into conquering the whole area. So you can see that slide that went all the way from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks, then to the Romans. Okay, and that's where we get the Septuagint. Do you remember what the Septuagint is?
It's the Greek version of the Old Testament, isn't it?
Why make a Greek copy of the Hebrew Old Testament? Well, basically what happened was the Greeks took over, and once the Greek took over, the universal language became Greek. And so a lot of the people didn't have Hebrew anymore. They didn't understand it, and people didn't have their own private copies. And so they made a translation into Greek, which was the common language.
I would guess that the scholars dominated the Greek, and since it was the scholars and the scribes that did the copying of the scriptures, right? So
Yeah,
that's probably
yeah.
why they did it too. They knew the audience would prefer it in Greek, that they were ready for.
They could reach a wider audience by having it in Greek. There's an interesting story. We don't know how true it is, that 70 scholars translated the entire Hebrew Old Testament in 70 days in Alexandria. And that's where they feel the Septuagint came from. Okay, so let's actually talk about our scriptures today. Ezra. Most of the events described in the book of Ezra, of them, the most notable is the completion of the temple in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed 70 years earlier by the Babylonians. So Ezra 1 through 6 contains an account of the return of the first group of Jews in approximately 537 and their efforts to rebuild the temple. Then Ezra 7 through 10 contains an account of actual Ezra's return to Jerusalem at a later date and his effort to help the Jews living there to keep the commandments. Ezra was a scribe and schooled in languages and the ability to read the scriptures and to interpret it for them, to tell them what they weren't doing right. It's kind of interesting because there was a lot of pushback from the local people when they started rebuilding the temple. The first thing that they rebuilt was the altar so that they could complete sacrifices. But as soon as they started rebuilding the actual temple, there was a huge amount of pushback, and even more so when they started building the walls around Jerusalem. And you can see that there's strategies that they used, the people who were there. Well, let's just talk about why the people who were there would not want the temple to be built. Any ideas?
Well, it was infringing on their little setup that they had going, and so it was going to sort of take away their authority.
Exactly. So for 70 years, there was no leadership, and so the people that were there kind of assumed the leadership. And a lot of those people were of a Samaritan nature, where they were mixed Jewish and other religions. And when the full-blooded Jews came and decided to rebuild the temple as per Cyrus's instructions, the Samaritans, the local people, asked if they could help. And the answer was no. you can't help. And so they were upset. And I think that they wanted to help for religious reasons to a certain extent, but a lot of it was political. They wanted to have the power to control what they had controlled for the last 70 years. And so as you read through the scriptures, you can see that they really started to get in the way. They weakened the hands of the people. They troubled them in building. They wrote out an accusation to the king of Persia and stated that the Jews were here and that if you let them build their temple and their walls, they're not going to pay tribute, that they were rebellious, that they were a bad city. They were mocked. The people were angry. They conspired against the Jews, and they even requested the workers not to work or to come down. Do we see any of that today?
Sure.
Anytime we go to build a temple anywhere, there's always initially a lot of pushback. And even just trying to live your life in the way that we feel is correct, we get the same kind of pushback that comes from the people that are around us, sometimes even from our own family. Well, their response, I think, is very enlightening because we can use it in our lives even today. This is a very applicable situation for us even today. There's a very famous scripture in Nehemiah 6:3 where he says, I can't come down. I'm busy doing some very, very important things. So the people tried to distract him. They actually had probably some mischief up their sleeve in order to stop him as a leader from rebuilding the walls. By the time we get to Nehemiah, it's more about the walls because the temple has been completed. Nehemiah 2, it talks about the God of heaven will prosper us, and the people had a mind to work. The people at this time, and I think Jewish people in general, are really hard workers. When they get their mind set on something, they really want to get it accomplished. And I think we could learn something from them. They set a watch both day and night. They said, be not afraid, remember the Lord. And they had the prophets there. We're going to study a little bit more later about the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, but they themselves get involved in the building process. And I think that that's kind of an excellent thing for us to look at, that we need to look at our prophets today to see what they want us to do. They're involved in trying to build the kingdom, and then we need to help them.
And they sang together by chorus, in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever towards Israel. And all people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and the chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy.
So we have kind of a mixed reaction. We have a lot of the people, especially the younger generation, being very jubilant, being very joyous that they finally have their temple rebuilt. But the older people, or the ancient people, as they're saying here, they're crying. Why do you think they're weeping?
I think these were the people that probably were old enough to remember when the temple was there before, and they missed it. They remember the blessings of it, so they were really.
Although continuity with the pre-exilic practices is emphasized, the loss of the first temple and its glory is still mourned. Compare the returnees' response in the dedication of the walls. Josephus, remember we talked about Josephus before, he was a Jew that kind of understood both the Roman practices and the Jewish practices, and he wrote a great history of the Jews from a point of view that would help the Romans to understand them. He emphasizes the irrevocable loss of the first temple by interpreting these verses to mean that the sound of the elders and the priests wailing was louder than the sound of the joy and the trumpets. Similarly, the rabbis interpret these verses to suggest that the majority of the returnees could recall the first temple and its glory. And although they were happy to have a temple again, it didn't compare at all to Solomon's temple. It's kind of like when Nephi arrives in America and he builds a temple. He says it was fashioned after Solomon's temple, but it wasn't Solomon's temple. It didn't have the glory and the pomp and the beauty.
There's no way they had the resources to build a temple like Solomon did.
Exactly. It's all about the resources and their ability to build it. Elder Talmage said this, in many respects, The temple of Zerubbabel appeared poor in comparison with its splendid predecessor in certain particulars. Indeed, it ranked lower than the ancient tabernacle of the congregation, the sanctity of nomadic tribes. Critical scholars specify the following characteristics of the Temple of Solomon that were lacking in the Temple of Zerubbabel. They didn't have the Ark of the Covenant. They didn't have sacred fire. The Shekinah, or the glory of the Lord, manifest of old as the divine presence. They didn't have the Urim and Thummim, of which Jehovah made plain his will to the priests of the Adamic or the Aaronic order. The genius or spirit of prophecy, indicative of the close communion between mortals and their God. Notwithstanding these differences, the Temple of Zerubbabel was recognized of God and was undoubtedly the site or seat of divine revelation to duly constituted prophets. And so they were missing a whole bunch of things. The locals wanted to help in building, but the Jews refused them. This continues, this deep rift between the northerners and the Jews, or the Samaritans and the Jews, that lasts all the way through the time of Jesus. Both groups, the Jews and the Samaritans, had a temple between 500 BC and 110 BC. But in 112, 111 BC, the Jews destroyed the Samaritan temple at Mount Gerizim. Some argue that this was in an effort to assimilate the Samaritans into the beliefs of the Jews. They got rid of that temple. They figured that they'd come down to Jerusalem, but it didn't work. So in a more modern context, what can we learn from this?
Yeah, we don't attack other people's churches in an effort to try to invite them into ours or to convince them they need to come and join ours. We don't do that.
It just doesn't work. You have to show them that what we have is good, and bring your good and join it with our good, and we'll have extra.
And I arose in the night, and I and some few men with me, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire.
So this is Nehemiah. When he first gets there, he does this trip around the city walls to kind of investigate how bad the damage is and how much work needs to be done. It's kind of interesting because he writes in detail about this reconnaissance that he does, and he does it at night because he's afraid to do it during the day. And so we even today have a really good idea of where the original walls were simply because of this description that happens in Nehemiah. And you can see from the map here, this is the original walls that went around the city and the temple site. And it came to pass from that time forth that my servants wrought in the work, and the other held both the spears, the shields, the bows, and the habergeons. Do you know what a habergeon is?
No.
It's armor. And the rulers were behind all the houses of Judah. And they which built on the wall, and they that bare burdens, with those that laden, every one with his own hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. And so they start building the walls, but they build it kind of like one hand building and one hand carrying a weapon. And we've seen this at other times in our church history. Do you remember any of them?
Yeah, when they were trying to finish the temple in Kirtland or Nauvoo, or which?
And Nauvoo, yeah. Both places, they kind of had to have a weapon in one hand while they had a trowel in the other hand. Thank goodness today we don't have that issue. Although I think from time to time we do have to sort of defend verbally what we're doing and kind of help people to understand why we do what we do. And I think that that's kind of a necessary thing. So you have to be able to, on one hand, preach the gospel, and on the other hand, kind of defend your personal beliefs.
At least we don't have to keep weapons in our hands. That's a good thing.
That's true. The Feast of the Tabernacles, it goes into quite an explanation in Nehemiah 8 about this Feast of the Tabernacles, or the Feast of Tents, as it is sometimes called. So I thought I'd talk about it a little bit. Because here in 18, it says, also day by day, from the first day until the last day, he read in the book of the law of God. And they kept the feast 7 days. And on the 8th day was a solemn assembly, according unto the manner. So this was a feast that is still kept even to this day in Jerusalem and in Jewish homes across the world. And then on the 8th day, they have a solemn assembly, which is something that we're a little bit more used to. So the Feast of the Tabernacles, this is one of the 3 great feasts at which the attendance of all male Israelites was compulsory. It was one of their greatest feasts, coming 5 days after the Day of Atonement. It was, or Yom Kippur. It was thus celebrated when the sins of the chosen people had been removed and when their special covenant relationship to Jehovah had been renewed and restored. Above all other occasions, it was one for rejoicing, bearing testimony and praising the Lord in the full sense. It is the feast of Jehovah, the one Mosaic celebration which, as part of the restitution of all things, shall be restored when Jehovah comes to reign personally upon the earth for 1,000 years. Even now we perform one of its chief rituals in our solemn assemblies, the giving of the Hosanna shout, and the worshippers of Jehovah shall yet be privileged to exult in other of its sacred rituals. It's also known as the Feast of Booths because Israel dwelt in booths or tents while in the wilderness, and as the Feast of Ingathering because it came after the completion of the harvest. It was a time of gladsome rejoicing and the extensive offering of sacrifices. More sacrifices were offered during the Feast of Passover than any other time because the lamb was slain and eaten by each family or group. But at the Feast of the Tabernacles, more sacrifices of bullocks, rams, lambs, and goats were offered by the priests for the nation as a whole than all the other Israelite feasts combined. The fact that it celebrated the completion of the full harvest symbolizes the gospel reality that it is the mission of the house of Israel to gather all nations to Jehovah, a process that is now going forward, but will not be completed until the millennial day when the Lord shall be king over all the earth and shall reign personally. Then shall be fulfilled that which is written in Zechariah. Now, I took a scripture from 1 Nephi 7.
Now ye know that Moses was commanded of the Lord to do that great work. And ye know that by his words the waters of the Red Sea were divided hither and thither, and they passed through on dry ground. But ye know that the Egyptians were drowned in the Red Sea, who were the armies of Pharaoh, and ye also know that they were fed with manna in the wilderness.
It's kind of interesting that Nephi goes through and reiterates these stories that were so famous. And he's talking to his brothers who are kind of like, we don't understand. Can you explain this to us? And so Nephi is explaining to them through telling stories of faith.
Yeah, because the brothers were kind of going, how are you going to get us to cross this? How are you going to build a ship? How are you going to lead us, like keep us from dying out here in the wilderness? And so Nephi's saying, well, Moses did it.
It's a favorite technique of all the prophets, because as we read through this, you'll find in Nehemiah 9, Nehemiah and Ezra are recounting to the people the stories from the past. Number one, because a lot of the people don't know them. They don't have the scriptures. Nobody's read the scriptures. And so there's this public declaration by Nehemiah and by Ezra to tell them the stories that will help them promote this faith. In this chapter, the people recount why they're in the predicament that they find themselves in, having just returned from Babylon and having to rebuild the temple, and why they're in a state now to covenant anew with their God. It's interesting that even today, when you're at General Conference, the people who are speaking will recite these stories, these historic things that happened in the past that we all believe in an effort to raise the people's faith. And I think that we need to continue to do that, especially as we talk to other people about the gospel. I remember so many times talking to people in Italy when I was on my mission. You probably had the same experience on your mission, where when they would have a particular problem, that you would recount stories or scriptures to help them to understand and to cope with their modern day problems. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah are very much like this. They help us to understand our problems even today. And the scriptures are like that anyway. You can always go to the scriptures to find solutions to your problems, no matter when. They're timeless. And that's why it's so important for us to read our scriptures every day and to know them well enough that we can use them in that context. And so my reading this week of Ezra and Nehemiah really cemented to me the importance of the scriptures. Because imagine being away from the scriptures for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, not having access to them.
Well, and I mean, I can see it now, but I also see it in this account where because they didn't have access to scriptures, they kept falling under the influence of the world and their ways, and we see that continually in what we've been studying the last couple of weeks. Also today, even in our families, when the scriptures aren't a part of life of our loved ones, they tend to drift towards the ways of the world.
If there's a vacuum there, they fill it with something else. And in the days of Israel and Judah, they filled it with the local religions because there wasn't anything coming from their side. Whatever the prevalent thing is in the day, I think basically they tried to do their best, but it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ.
No.
And so that's really my testimony, that we need to read the scriptures every day. And I think we have access to so much today because we're under so much assault that without it, we have no choice. There's no way that we could win. We can't resist because there's so much garbage out there. We just need to read our scriptures every day and take that time every day to do something for ourselves, to make sure that we're still on the same wavelength with the Lord.
And we need to do more, just a little bit more than that. We need to try to, of course, identify the principles that are being taught and then live them, apply them in our lives. So it's not enough just to know the stories. We need to live the stories and apply. And like you said, all these things are applicable. We can look for, there's examples in our lives where they're all applicable.
I like the fact that we have the Come Follow Me, and it gives us a framework in which we can not only read and study, but teach our families. I love the idea. I love the whole concept.
Okay, well, thanks, Carl. What a great small discussion that we had. Well, small it isn't just you and me, but but we know that a lot. But there are people that view this later and appreciate it, and it helps them with learning. So certainly welcome anyone to do that, and to also pass it on to others that may.
And don't forget to like and subscribe.
By liking and subscribing, so that helps to also pass it on. So thanks, Carl.